Good afternoon. I'm going to call this meeting of the Board of Zoning Appeals to order. Can we have the, request that the staff confirmation that the Kansas Open Meetings Act required notice has been properly provided?
Yes, I can confirm that the packet was posted and the required notice was provided.
Very good. Thank you. We'll have roll call.
All right. Board Member Dorsweiler.
Present.
Board Member May.
Here.
Board Member Troe.
Here.
Board Member Paget. Board Member Creer.
Present.
Board Member Owens.
Here.
Chair Hardy.
Here.
So we have 6 of our appointed 7 members present. That constitutes a quorum, and we provided notice of today's meeting so we can proceed with today's agenda.
Thank you. At this time, we'll have approval of the minutes of the October 3rd, 2024 special meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes? Do you have any corrections or changes?
I move we approve the minutes.
We have a motion
Second.
and a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Okay.
Minutes will be filed as presented. Under new business, we have 2 applications. The first application is number V24-6, filed by Karen S. Meyer on behalf of the Meyer family. At this time, we'll have a summary presentation by staff.
Okay. This is a variance request, a front yard setback variance request on a corner lot to allow the construction of a 16-foot sunroom addition on the west side of an existing attached dwelling. And Mr. Roberts, to my left, is going to be presenting the staff report.
Thank you, Dean. So the subject property for this application is located on the southeast corner of the intersection of Fairdale Road and Village Lane. The townhome on the lot was built in November of 1993. Additionally, the Village Place Townhomes addition, where this townhome is located, was platted in 1993, and the applicant's townhome occupies Lot 1 of that addition. The applicant's dwelling sits on an irregular shaped lot that is approximately 68.88 feet in width and 105.56 feet in depth, for a total square footage of 6,570 square feet. The lot is oriented toward and addressed off of Village Lane, and as constructed, the dwelling has a 25-foot setback from Village Lane and a 25-foot setback from Fairdale Road. The applicant's contractor, Zach Prester of Prester Building and Design, submitted a building permit application on June 10, 2024, proposing to construct a 12-foot by 17-foot sunroom addition onto the southwest corner of the dwelling. The proposed enclosed addition would be a post frame structure with a stick framed roof with a 612 pitch to match the roof of the home. Based on the rendering provided that Dustin has up on the screen, it appears the sunroom will have asphalt shingles to match the house. In reviewing the application, planning staff determined that the proposed addition did not meet the minimum front yard building setback requirement on a corner lot. As a result, staff advised the applicant that a permit could not be issued because the zoning ordinance requires a 25-foot setback, front yard setback. The applicant was informed of this, and on September 10, 2024, filed an application to come to this board for a variance request. So the applicant has applied for a front yard setback variance to allow the construction of this new 12-foot by 17-foot enclosed sunroom. Staff initially determined that the proposed addition would extend 11 feet into the front yard setback area. However, based on an existing notch in the west wall of the townhome unit, it appears the sunroom addition would extend approximately 9 feet into the required 25-foot front yard setback along Fairdale Road, which would result in a proposed setback of approximately 16 feet at its nearest point from the property line along Fairdale Road. The applicant's townhome unit maintains a 25-foot front yard setback from the west property line along Fairdale Road, the non-address side of that lot. In 1995, a text amendment was passed to reduce the required front yard setback on a corner lot to 20 feet on the non-address side. However, since this property was located in a subdivision that was platted before that amendment, there is a 25-foot setback that is enforced in this subdivision. As proposed, the applicant's proposed sunroom would extend approximately, if the 20-foot setback applied, the sunroom would extend 4 feet into that setback. Because of the front yard setback encroachment, the applicant is requesting the Board of Zoning Appeals approve a front yard setback variance to allow the enclosed sunroom addition to be constructed in this proposed location. So next we have a couple of zoning code sections for you to look at. So section 42 is the section that establishes 4275 is the section of the Salina zoning ordinance that establishes the minimum front yard setback in the R2 district, which sets it at 25 feet from the property line. And section 4282 is the section that was passed in 1995 that shows the 20 feet on a corner lot, which, however, does not apply in this case. An idea of the surrounding land uses. So the property is surrounded by townhomes on each side. So there is a townhome adjacent to it, and then on each corner of Fairdale and Village Lane. So for a variance application, we look at specific criteria that the variance might meet. So now we will walk through each of those criteria. First one being uniqueness. So the need for a variance must be caused by a condition which is unique to the property in question and not shared by other properties in the area. Some examples are undersized lots, uniquely shaped lots, or a need to protect existing improvements or trees. The owner's contractor states that this lot is unique because the home has 2 front yard setbacks of 25 feet because it is on a corner lot. Additionally, the applicant states that because the property was split into 2 different lots, the corner has more square footage of buildable area. Staff would agree that the lot at 2300 Village Lane is unique from the standpoint of being a corner lot with 2 front yards and no side yard. This severely limits where an attached addition can fit on the lot without requiring some form of setback relief. Staff would also agree that the lot is unique in the fact that the lot is bigger when compared to neighboring lots, as being a corner lot increases the total square footage of the lot, which is approximately 6,752 square feet. Staff would also note that because this is a corner lot, it has 2 front yards, 1 0 setback side yard, and a second side yard on the north that is completely occupied by a utility easement. There's no place to build but to the west and into the west front yard. The second criteria we look at is no adverse effects on neighbors. The variance must not cause any adverse effects on neighboring properties. The owner's contractor states that the sunroom addition will have no effect on adjacent property owners or residents. Staff would agree that the structure as it is proposed would seem to be compatible in appearance with the materials of the dwelling on the property, and it would appear that any effects due to increase in size of the dwelling would appear to be localized to this zoning lot. An existing 6-foot privacy fence would additionally minimize the visual impact of the addition. The third criteria is unnecessary hardship. The applicant must show that not granting the variance will cause an unnecessary hardship by denying reasonable or beneficial use of the property. The owner's contractor states that not granting the variance would cause an unnecessary hardship because there was previously a deck constructed in the location. The deck has since been removed because of issues with water coming underneath the deck, and there's now nothing in that location, and there's a sliding glass door that exits out of the house that now leads to nothing without a new addition. Staff would agree that building an enclosed sunroom of lesser size would limit the usefulness and functionality of the space, and there does not appear to be any alternative location where it could be built. However, staff would like to point out that personal inconvenience alone does not demonstrate that the property owner would be denied reasonable or beneficial use of the entire property if a variance is not approved. The fourth criteria we'll look at is effect on public health, safety, and welfare. The requested variance must not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. The owner's contractor states that the proposed sunroom addition would have no adverse effects on the public. Additionally, the applicant states that not approving the requested setback variance would affect the homeowner negatively because they have a yard that has a setback that they are currently unable to enjoy. Finally, the applicant states the addition of the sunroom would only help the appeal of the home. Staff would agree that the impact of the enclosed sunroom would be localized. However, front yard building setbacks ensure that a dwelling units and porches or additions are not placed too close to the street and ensure that there is an adequate visibility for vehicles backing out of driveway and into streets. It would appear that the proposed addition will not reduce the visibility of vehicles using the intersection, as there is a 6-foot privacy fence that is located and there are no driveways along the side of Fairdale Road. The fifth criteria we look at is conformity with general spirit and intent of the ordinance. The variance must conform to the general spirit and intent of the zoning ordinance. The owner's contractor states that granting the variance would not undermine the intent and general spirit of the zoning ordinance because the non-address front yard should be used in a different manner on a corner lot where there's no space in the backyard. The purpose of having a front yard 25-foot setback is now reduced to 20 foot in some circumstances for the non-address side of corner properties is to preserve adequate open space adjacent to public roadways. Open space adjacent to the roadway is important for maintaining adequate sight lines and visibility, and the 25-foot setback requirement has been uniformly enforced in this subdivision. However, both Fairdale and Village Lane are classified as local streets that have 60 foot of right-of-way and 33 feet of paving. The infrastructure around this area is completely developed, with each of these streets serving the local area, and as a result, it is unlikely that the right-of-way width would ever change or would need to be widened, and there are no sidewalks that exist on this stretch of Fairdale Road. So, staff has provided a summary of possible findings for approval for this variance request. You can find those on page 6 of your staff report. The subject property is unique because it is approximately 6,570 square feet corner lot with 2 front yards and minimal side yards. The proposed sunroom addition would be constructed of materials compatible in design with the residential structure. And there's an existing 6-foot privacy fence that will limit the visual impact on neighboring structures. There are no alternative locations on the property where a sunroom addition could be built that would not require a setback variance or building in an easement. The proposed addition will have no impact on the public health, safety, or welfare of the public. The main purpose of having the front yard 25-foot setback from the property line is to ensure the development of corner lots is compatible with the remainder of the properties along the street. In this case, because the house was constructed before 1995, the ordinance allowing non-address front yards to have 20 feet does not apply. However, if it did apply, the sunroom would only encroach approximately 4 feet into the setback area. So staff has identified the following alternatives for the board's consideration. You could approve the front yard setback variance as requested with or without any conditions. The board could approve a lesser setback variance than requested with or without any conditions. The board could postpone consideration of this application if more information is needed, or the board could deny the applicant's request if the required findings of fact cannot be made. Staff recommendation, staff would request that the applicant, contractor confirm the dimensions of the proposed addition. If the applicant is sufficiently able to demonstrate why an alternate plan would not be a feasible alternative, then staff would recommend that approval of the requested would recommend approval of the requested front yard setback be made subject to the following condition. And that condition would be that the proposed sunroom addition shall be compatible in design, material, and color with the house on the property. And in the elevation drawing, it seems that would be the case. Staff would like to note that there are some discrepancies on the length of the proposed sunroom addition. There was a supplemental document you can find in your packet that says the sunroom will be 12 foot by 16 feet, while the rendering that's on the screen shows a length of 17 feet. If they're proposed, and staff would like to note that if the proposed sunroom is in fact 17 feet in length, it would extend 9 feet into the, approximately 9 feet into the 25-foot setback. And there's one photo, Dustin, if we can pull up the photo, it should say site visit, yes. So just wanted to show you this as well. This shows that there is a 6-foot privacy fence constructed, and the addition would go right where Dustin's cursor is. So as you can see, there's not a ton of visual impact from the street in this case. So staff is available for any questions, and the applicant is here to answer any questions as well.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for staff at this point?
One quick one. Did I miss it? How tall is it?
So that will be, that's a good question. That would be,
Might be on the elevation.
yeah.
Dustin can pull that up.
About 10
Is
feet.
that on the elevation?
10 feet?
9 foot. 9.6.
Yeah, so it is it's 9.61 feet.
Okay,
So
thank you.
To the EU.
to the, okay.
Other questions?
What would be the actual distance when completed? It would be between the building, the new existing building with the distance between the fence? How much length is there, just out of curiosity?
Well, the fence is supposed to be on the property line, so if this is, in fact, because this is difficult for us because there's a notch there back in that location, but if it is, the fence would be located where the black line is here,
Okay.
and so our distances are gonna be 16 to, because this line is not straight. The setback gets bigger as you go south, and so we're measuring the setback from its closest point, but you'd have that distance of 16 to 18 feet between the edge of the sunroom addition and where the fence is located on the property line.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I got one. Overhangs can extend past setback.
We do not count overhangs for setbacks, so when someone builds a house or they build a structure, we measure to the foundation wall. So if you have a 7.5 foot setback on a new dwelling construction, we're gonna measure to see if they're 7.5 feet from the foundation wall over to the property line, and the overhang or eave does not count for setback purposes.
So if it's probably a 2 foot recess there in the corner, and if that 17 by 14 that's shown on that plan is the overhang, they'd be gaining 1 more foot of setback.
So when staff was looking at this, we tried to take into account the 17-foot measurement, and I believe on the screen here that we considered the 17-foot measurement when accounting for setbacks, yes. So it would be the 18 feet and 16 feet from the property line respectively, and encroach between 8.7 feet and 7 feet into
But it does not look like a particularly large overhang to us. It might be 4, might be 6 inches at best. But again, we're doing the best we can with the drawings. We know that this encroaches into the required front yard setback, will the total variance be 9 feet or between 8 and 9 feet or more than that. We do not have, the plans were not prepared and submitted on a survey, so we're calculating the setback. All we can tell you is that they need a setback variance to bring it out this far to the west, and you can judge based on the plans how much of an encroachment you think that is.
Thank you. Any other questions this time? Not, the applicant is present. Would you please step to the microphone and give us your name and address for the record, please?
Hello, I'm Karen Meyer. My address is 2300 Village Lane, and I can answer most of the questions.
Okay. Do you have that note about the size of the building?
Well, I do. We said 12 by 16. I'd love it if you said 17, because that'd be better for me. But we actually asked 12 by 16. And previously, the deck that was there actually went further south than the actual building, and we're not doing that. We're not asking to do that. We're keeping it flush with the existing house. So we're actually encroaching less to the south, but a little farther west.
Okay, very good. Do you have any other comments you would like to make that staff may have not picked up on?
You can't tell it from the pictures, but we've done a lot of work to this dwelling, house, whatever. New roof, new stucco, new fence, and I realize you can't tell it. It does look so much better than it did. You know, our intentions are not to do anything, it's a public meeting, but half-assed, so to speak. So that's not our MO, but I mean, we tried to price, I know it doesn't have any impact on your decision, but we tried to figure out alternatives, whether that was, pergolas and all sorts of different ideas, and the prices were all kind of similar. Sad, but true. And so we live in Kansas, and I know, again, this has nothing to do with this meeting and the variance, but if we're going to bother to spend that much money on doing something out there to make use of that space and the door and reclaim a little bit of space back there, it doesn't make sense to make something that doesn't function terribly well in Kansas, for us anyway. So that's why we've moved to the sunroom and the drastic measures that brought me here today.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Are there any questions for the applicant?
Not for applicant, I do have one for Dean.
Okay.
If we did make a motion to accept this, would we accept it for the 12 by 16 or the 17? What would be the suggestion of that?
I think the 17 feet is probably from edge of roof line to edge of roof line, and if we're looking at what the enclosed space is, it's 12 by 16. The part that makes this difficult, and you have to go back to the drawing, Dustin, there appears to be a notch in the house.
It's 4 feet.
Yeah, and so we're doing the best we can based on what the contractor gave us. So again, all we're telling you is it's a 12 by 16 addition. It's not going to be, you're approving a 12 by 16 addition, and we can't till we can go out and measure it. We can't tell you exactly what the setback is. We can just tell you that it encroaches into the 25-foot front yard, and your evaluation is whether you think a justification has been made to allow the addition to extend into the 25-foot front yard. And I don't think we should get caught up too much into the dimensions, other than to know that's a 12-foot by 16-foot enclosed space.
Go ahead.
If I may, the notch is 4 feet setback. And when we put the new fence up, because it, well, it was janky, the old one, and not straight, and we actually brought it in from the property line just a little bit to make it straight and true. So if we judge by the old fence, there's probably actually, a little bit less than what the old fence showed, because we brought it in just a little bit to straighten it out, make it look better.
Okay, any other questions for the applicant? Okay, thank you. All right, we'll bring the question back to the commission for any discussion, potential action.
I guess I just put my thoughts out there. I find it difficult to be able to justify the full variance. I could justify the 20-foot setback just because that would be something that would be allowed under current code, but I don't feel that there's enough or argument here to justify a full variance. Just my 2 cents.
You mean the variance that was requested?
Yeah, the full variance. I don't see justification for that, but I could just justify a partial variance for the 20-foot setback instead of a 25.
I would like to comment on the fact that I've driven by and stopped and looked it over. I agree with what you're saying also, but in this particular situation, the way it sits on that corner, there's a lot of room there, so I would be willing to go with the full 16 feet.
I think one of the things that, and we probably didn't emphasize it enough, but if you could either put up one of the surveys or something, Dustin, one of the things that makes this unique compared to a lot of residential cases that come before us is when you build on a corner lot, you do not have a rear yard. And so this property has a side yard to the east and it has a side yard to the south. And because it has a side yard to the south, it's only 10 feet from the property line. And so on a typical home, say the home I own, I have 65 feet from the back of my house to the rear property line. This has 10 feet, and that 10 feet is occupied by an easement. And so there's no choice about doing anything out but to the west. And so it's your judgment call of how far out to the west we go. But to be blunt, we have not had much help from the contractor in figuring out exactly what the end result's going to be. The survey from the original townhome that was built has a square building with no notch in it. And if you look at the elevation drawing, you can't tell what that notch is, and I couldn't tell you if that notch is 4 feet or 2 feet. But the notch is not clearly identifiable on these plans. So if you could go back to that plan drawing again, Dustin. So if we do the math, and the existing setback is something on the order of 30 feet, and then there's a 4-foot notch, then in that location it's going to be something like 34 feet. And if we come out 16 feet, then we're still going to be in the neighborhood of 18 feet, which is not that far from the 20. And so we can tell you that if that's 4-foot notch, then the building is gonna stick out 12 feet from the face of the townhome. And that's presuming that that notch is in fact 4 feet. But that, if you compare it to the 20-foot setback that you could do if this was new construction in a different neighborhood, it's, even as proposed, it's not that far off from having a 20-foot setback. It's just, we've done the best we can based on what the contractor has given us, but if you go back and look at the building permit survey, there's no notch in it. And so we've had to construct this both for the owner and for this board because the contractor's not giving us any help.
Let's see, can I comment? So this drawing shows 3'6", whether it's accurate. And then, yeah, like Dean said, if it's 4 foot, it would overhang the 20-foot setback 1.7 feet. If we went off 3'6", it would overhang the 20-foot setback 2.1 feet. If that is
If that notch is all correct. So it's
by a
it's
16-foot depth, not a 17. You could.
yeah, it's not, even if you approved it as it is proposed, I don't think it's going much beyond what a 20-foot setback would end up being. So it's your choice about a lesser setback, but I'm not sure we could. I guess what we could advise you is that if it was a total of 12 by 14 instead of 12 by 16, then I think that would get you to the 20 feet. But we think we're somewhere between 18 and 19 feet. The other thing that is different about this is that the property line along Fairdale, the setback gets wider as you go south, and this is towards the south end. And so all we know is that it encroaches in the 25-foot setback, and it's not something that we could approve administratively, but I think you're in the best position to judge about the encroachment and how that would impact the neighboring property owners. But to me, the thing that's most unique about this is that these townhomes have no backyard whatsoever. There's not even an option of building anything because the original builder decided to park the back end of it right on the utility easement. So it is not just the fact that it's a corner lot, but it's a corner lot that doesn't really have anything that could be called a rear yard.
Any other comments?
I got a quick one here. I don't think that you're trying to set anything up, but to me, when I hear, well, we don't know this and we're not sure over there, I see possibilities in the future where somebody that's not so honest can come in and, if we're not sure. But again, I don't see you're doing anything wrong. It's just, I think that in the future there might be somebody who could take that and turn it. But that's kind of my thought on it.
And I think the other thing to look at on this, and I've got to keep flipping back and forth to the drawings, but does anyone know what so I guess the total length of the sidewall of the townhome is 70 feet, and this extension out is 12 feet. So if you look at it from the standpoint of having a 70-foot long wall facing Fairdale Road, only 12 feet of that 70-foot wall would have the encroachment in it, and I think that's something that you can take into account.
Are these, is this lot substandard from current zoning lot sizes? Or does it meet, would it meet current?
It has adequate depth. We get, the minimum depth is 100 feet. If you're looking at how current residential areas are being platted, most new residential areas have anywhere in the neighborhood from 125 to 130 foot lot depths. So while the 105 foot is not substandard by code, if you look at it in terms of comparing it to other residential areas, these lots are shallower than what you would typically see.
I would be willing to make a motion on accepting it as is. The reason being because it's already got 4 foot, 3.5 foot, 4 foot, whatever it is set in. If they were asking the full 16, if the building was straight down, I would disagree with that, but I'm willing to make a motion to accept it.
All right, we have a motion to approve application number V24-6. Is there a second?
I'll second it just so we can vote.
Discussion.
The only thing I'd like to verify would be whether it's the 16 foot or 17 foot. If we have that on record, so we know what to approve.
Has anybody had any contact with Mr. Preston? Tell us.
Or we can motion to add 16 feet as the total depth from the existing 3 foot or 4 foot depth.
Well, Mr. Prester, who's the contractor, tells us that this is a 12 by 16 building. What I can't speak to the diagram he gave us that has the 17 feet on it. That would seem to imply that you'd have an overhang on the east side, and that makes no sense since this is going to run up flush with the house. So if you look, could you go to the diagram, Dustin?
So if you had a 1 foot overhang, it'd be 17 feet.
The diagram that shows the 3D. So one thing that makes this hard to read is that you could look at this as it not being flush or attached. Nobody thinks there's going to be an overhang on this side, so I don't know why it's shown as 17 feet. We don't have Mr. Prester here to tell us, and the owner doesn't seem to be able to tell us, but I'm going to assume that this wall is going to be flush with the wall of the townhome. So I think this number here is deceiving, and the number that matters is the way we would measure it is based on the dimensions of the enclosed space. And if this was a storage shed, I would tell you it's a 12 by 16 storage shed. And a 12 by 16 storage shed with a pitched roof might have a roof distance of 17 feet, edge of roof to edge of roof. But I think we're getting deceived by that 17-foot number, and that it is 16 feet from the notch in the wall, which means if the notch is 3 feet 6 inches, that it's 16 feet minus 3.6 feet, and that is how much it's extending out from the flush of the wall.
So I would like to make a comment on the motion. In looking at the motion to approve, the thing that keeps getting me is we don't have a survey to even know if we're going to need to be making a variance. potentially. So I don't necessarily know that we have enough data to move forward with that. Having said that, let's assume our rough math is correct, and we're going to be extending over it by 2 feet. The question is that something that the board wants to do? And that's why we vote.
I'm gonna let Mr. Michelson, who did the actual building permit plan review and who told the owner and Mr. Prester that we could not issue this building permit as submitted because of the setback. I'm gonna let him describe how he arrived at his conclusions.
3D and this one. Okay, so hope I can add a little bit more without confusing the issue more. First off, this diagram I drew with that notch in the building being 3 feet, and that was an assumption I did based off just trying to look at various photos and the 3D sketch, or it's a SketchUp model, it looks like, and his other plans. There's clearly discrepancy there. I drew this yellow box at 17 feet coming off of the inset notch wall. So with that being 3 feet in, and the applicant says it's 4 now, then you would need to adjust the outer, the dimension that I did out to the property line by a foot, so that would be actually in a little bit more. And with it being, if it's really 16, then that encroachment is even less. I believe that, based on looking at the plans, that it's more likely that the 3D model, the 17 foot on there, was a mistake, because everything else in the application says 12 by 16. It's fairly consistent in that, but yeah, there's some issues with the dimensions on the plans, and I don't know what that comes from, but that was my take on it. My understanding of it is that the 17, it was probably an error, but since it was in the plans, I drew that overhead plan view diagram as 17 just to err on the side of, safety of showing it bigger than it may be, so that if you're considering it, if it's actually 17, then you guys had considered the actual correct dimensions. If we're looking at it being a 4 foot notch, then that would make that, where it says north proposed setback, it would only be 15.6. And since the applicant said that the building's only 16 feet instead of 17, then that would make that, I'm sorry, I said 15.6. It would make that proposed setback 18.6 feet. Do you see what I mean? Because the notch has moved, so the whole new addition moves inward by 1 foot. Plus, if it's a foot shorter, then it seems to me that the proposed setback would be 18.6, the smallest of the two. There's the north and the south, just because of the variation in the front yard setback. Does that make sense, or I can clarify that if I need to?
Would it make a difference if we amended the motion to include the number 16 as the one that we're approving?
There's 2 ways to do it. One is to limit, say that you're granting a variance to allow a 12 by 16 foot sunroom addition. The other way to do it is to say that you're willing to grant a variance of X feet, and if that number is arrived at, then that's what they'd have to build to. But it seemed like, of the 2 choices, telling them that the addition is limited to 12 by 16, then that is more finite than is trying to establish what distance it needs to be from the Fairdale property line.
All right. Okay. Does that sound compatible with what you're thinking?
So I don't know if we want to have a clarification from the maker of the motion, but what we have down is we have a motion from Board Member Creer to approve the plan as presented. We think we've clarified for you that the plan is for a 12 by 16 addition, and we have a second from Mr. Tro. So if we'd like, we could ask the maker of the motion whether he wants to clarify his motion to say that when he says approve it as submitted, that is approving it limited to a 12 by 16 addition.
I would like to make that amendment.
Okay, so to clarify the motion is to grant approval of variance application B24-6, limiting the size of the proposed addition to 12 by 16. And a second from Mr. Tro.
And just to further clarify, staff did have a suggested condition. Are you including that as part of your motion?
Yes.
Okay, so we have the amended motion with the clarification added from staff. And the second, is that, okay? Just further discussion on the motion. All right.
Just, would we want to put anything in there about possible overhang? I mean, I know I'm getting picky here, but.
Yeah, the overhang
That just
doesn't count.
The overhang is
Okay.
whether it has a 12-inch or a 16-inch or an 18-inch overhang is not matter. We're talking about what the setback is from the west wall of the building to the Fairdale property line. That's what's in discussion.
Okay, all in favor of approving application number V24-6, amended with clarifications and a few other things, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries.
So is that a 5-1?
5-1. Thank you. Okay, our next application is number V24-7, filed by Becky Keir, requesting a variance to section 42-58, 1 of the Salina zoning ordinance. We'll have the staff presentation this time.
So this request is filed for a property at 1620 East North Street, and section 42-558-1 limits residential lots to having 2 individual accessory structures. And the request here is to allow the construction of a new carport structure, which would be a 4th accessory structure on the lot. And so Mr. Michelson worked with Ms. Kerr on this, and so he's going to be presenting the report.
Thank you, Dean. The property that's subject to this application is a 1.6 acre unplatted lot on the south side of East North Street, east of Lakewood Park, and is addressed as 1620 East North Street. This was previously part of the Thomas White Farms, and it was annexed in 1967. It's currently zoned R1. And the city zoning ordinance limits residential lots to a total of 2 detached accessory structures, specifically one with a maximum size of 360 square feet for a shed or storage building, and 1 detached carport or garage with a maximum size of 770 square feet. The existing dwelling is 2,176 square feet, and it was permitted and constructed in 1972. And it appears to have replaced the previous dwelling that existed in the almost same location, at least as far back as 1957 on our aerial photos. And the property currently has 3 existing accessory buildings, one of which appears on an aerial photo in 1958 and is a 32 by 22 approximately, covered but unenclosed equipment and tool shelter that, based on what the applicant told me, just uses it to store like bicycle and mower and stuff like that. It's fairly low in height, I don't know that you can actually even walk under it. The other two detached buildings first appear in 1973, and so those came in a little bit later, but the point to that is that these buildings have been there for decades, and those other two buildings are a 10-foot by 24-foot chicken coop and a 24 by 24 barn. Combined, the existing dwelling and the three buildings have a total footprint of 3,696 square feet, which only covers 5.3% of that lot. And the applicant acquired the property in 1997, so clearly those structures have been there long before, as well as the dwelling. In July of 2024, the applicant applied for a building permit to construct a new 20 by 21 foot detached carport on the east side yard of her property, up towards the front of the property at North Street. Staff denied the building permit and let the applicant know that they had two options because the property already had three existing detached accessory structures, which already exceeded the limit of detached structures. They were given the options of removing two of the existing structures in order to add one new one and be in conformance with the code, or they could apply for a variance to construct a fourth detached accessory structure. So as I said, the applicant owns the home with the dwelling and the three detached accessory structures existing, and is proposing to construct a new 20 by 21 foot carport on the east side yard towards the front of the property. That would be the fourth accessory structure on this lot, which would exceed the maximum number of structures allowed. The proposed carport is 420 square feet and would increase the percentage of the lot coverage from 5.3 to 5.9%. And the R1 zoning district allows a 35% lot coverage, so it's well within that. As justification for the variance, the applicant states that she has a large lot with these pre-existing agricultural buildings that were there when she bought the property, and she has a need for additional vehicle storage. None of the existing detached buildings could actually accommodate that vehicle storage need. And as far as the zoning ordinance requirements, the limitations on accessory buildings are in 4258, section 4258, and it allows, as I said before, one storage building or structure incidental to a permitted use up to 360 square feet, and one detached garage or carport up to 770 square feet. Around this property, it's fairly isolated in a sense, because on the south side of North Street, this is the only residential lot nearby. It's bounded on the west by Lakewood Park, which is actually R1 zoning, but it's a park. It's not a residential lot. On the east is C5 zoning with non-climatized storage buildings for Great Plains manufacturing. To the north is I3 zoning, and that is industrial. It's mostly Great Plains and some other various industrial uses. And to the south, it's ag. It's a county, so this is right at the city limit. So you have the Smoky River and ag land to the south. So as far as the 5 criteria that to consider for the variance, the first criteria is uniqueness, and that would be a condition unique to the property. A need for the variance must be caused by a condition which is unique to the property in question and not shared by other properties in the area. The applicant states that she has a large lot with existing agricultural buildings which predate the current zoning regulations, and she has a need for additional weather protected storage for her vehicle. Staff would agree that the existing agricultural buildings appear to predate the current zoning regulations, but we would note that having a larger lot size or oversized lot is not in and of itself a justification for having additional accessory structures. The question here is what's unique about the property or circumstances that creates the need for having the carport to shelter vehicles in addition to an attached garage and the other accessory buildings on the lot. And I don't think I mentioned it before, but the dwelling does have an attached garage, but based on conversations with the applicant, that garage has a fairly small door. The width of it's not quite enough to accommodate her pickup truck, and so it can't actually physically get inside the attached garage. So for the second criteria, no adverse effects on neighbors. A variance must not cause any adverse effects on the neighboring properties. And the applicant states that the proposed carport would not have an adverse effect on the neighbors, primarily because she doesn't have any residential lots to either side of her, with the park to the west and commercial to the east with large non-climatized storage buildings, and across the street is mostly industrial there are a few residential lots across the street, but they're not directly across the street. And the Smoky Hill River and agricultural land to the south. So staff would agree that due to this lot being the only residential lot among the adjacent properties on the south side, and the fact that their property is entirely screened by mature shade trees on all sides, it doesn't appear that the addition of the proposed carport would have an adverse effect on the neighboring properties. The I-3 and the C5 zone lots to the north and east have multiple large metal buildings, and the proposed carport would be metal, so risk of fire spread would be minimal, and the carport wouldn't detract from the visual appearance of the neighborhood, nor would it restrict the flow of air or block light. The carport would be constructed over a gravel surface, partial gravel, partial existing concrete of the driveway, and it doesn't appear that it would increase any runoff from the property. Staff would note that the design and the appearance of the proposed carport appears to be at least partially compatible with the existing dwelling on the lot, and we would note that we have not received any objections to the proposed carport from any neighboring property owners. For the third criteria, unnecessary hardship, the applicant must show that not granting the variance would cause an unnecessary hardship by denying reasonable or beneficial use of the property. So the applicant states that her property is one of only 5 other residential lots in the vicinity, with the remainder of the properties being commercial and industrial. She also stated that due to the numerous large trees surrounding the property, she needs a protected location to park her pickup truck based on previous storms, branches falling, and things of that nature. The existing attached garage located on the north side of the dwelling is too narrow to accommodate her pickup truck, and if the carport is not approved, she would not be able to fully utilize her property by having a place to park her vehicle. And she believes that the strict application of the limit on the accessory structures would constitute an unnecessary hardship by denying her the ability to protect her vehicle from weather and falling branches and stuff like that. So staff would note that there are 3 existing accessory structures on the lot, and none of them are capable of sheltering a vehicle to suit her needs. So for the fourth criteria is effect on public health, safety, and welfare. The requested variance must not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. The applicant states that any effects from the carport would be localized, and the proposed structure would not block light or the movement of air, and will not impede visibility on North Street, and it would only serve as protection for a vehicle from damage due to falling branches. Staff would agree that any impacts from the proposed carport would be localized, and placement of the carport wouldn't block sunlight or air or increase the risk of fire spread or affect drainage on neighboring properties due to its location, because the building site is so remote from any of those. As proposed, it would be in conformance with the required setbacks from the front and side property lines as well. For the fifth criteria, conformity with the general spirit and intent of the zoning ordinance, the applicant states that the proposed carport would not be opposed to the general spirit and intent of the zoning ordinance because the property is located property is surrounded by mostly commercial and industrial properties, as well as Lakewood Park and agricultural land. The purpose and intent of having numerical and size limitations is to keep residential areas looking residential by not allowing garages, carports, or sheds to be taller than or out of scale with the house that they serve. Requiring that garages, carports, and sheds be architecturally compatible with the dwelling on the lot also ensures residential compatibility. Having too many accessory buildings on a lot can lead to overcrowding and visual clutter as well. And staff would agree that the applicant's property is relatively isolated and is one of only a few residential lots nearby, and that the agricultural background of the pre-existing buildings and the property itself would support the argument that it's unique when compared to a typical residential subdivision or property within one. We would also agree that the presence of the large shade trees lining the property on all sides would support the applicant's claim that any visual effects of the additional structure would primarily be contained to her property. And with the adjacent properties containing mostly industrial or commercial land uses, staff would agree that the net effect of the additional structure would likely not have any impact on those adjacent properties. So in addition to that, staff had a few comments about the compatibility, as with that being one of the requirements for detached accessory structures, having to be compatible with the residential nature of residential lots. Sorry, I lost my place. So Section 4258 requires that residential accessory buildings, including carports, be compatible with the dwelling they serve in terms of design, appearance, and materials. And in order for the board to approve a second the carport, it needs to make a finding under criteria number 5 that approval of the carport would not violate the spirit and intent of the ordinance because 1, the proposed building would not be out of scale with the surrounding area, and 2, the proposed building would maintain the residential appearance and character of the neighborhood. And in order to get a building permit for the detached carport, it must have at least 3 points of compatibility with the house that it serves out of a list of 5 criteria. So the applicant has submitted plans for the prefabricated carport, which would have unenclosed sides and a metal roof, which are partially compatible with the house when compared with the design of it. The existing dwelling is brown with white trim, and the carport will be white, which, given the unenclosed nature of it, could be considered as compatible since it would somewhat be comparable to the trim color of the house. The roof pitch of the carport would be 3 to 12, which appears that it would be a fairly close match to the dwelling, as it does have a pretty low-pitched roof. And it's a similar roof style. It's a gable roof style. The carport would have a peak height of 10 feet, which is less than that of the existing dwelling as well. And it does appear to staff that the applicant's plans would meet the necessary 3 points of compatibility with the existing house. If approved, the carport would increase the total building coverage on this lot from 5.3 to 5.9%, which is still significantly less than the 35% maximum allowed on a lot in an R1 district. And so in considering this application, we have the board alternatives on page 7 of your staff report. The board could approve the variance to the limit on the number of accessory buildings allowed on a residential lot as requested if the required findings of fact can be made. 2, the board could approve a lesser variance, for example, requiring the removal of one of the existing accessory structures to allow construction of the carport if the required findings of fact can be made. 3, the board could postpone action on this application with the consent of the applicant if additional information is required to reach a decision. 4, the board could deny the applicant's request if the findings of facts cannot be made. And on page 7 of your staff report, we've provided a few suggested findings that we believe can be made in support of approval of the variance. 1, the need for the variance to the limit on the number of accessory structures allowed on the residential lot being requested arises from conditions which are unique to this property and are not shared by neighboring properties because the property is isolated from other nearby residential lots, with the abutting lots having non-residential land uses on all sides. The 3 existing agricultural buildings predate the current zoning regulations, and none of them can sufficiently meet the needs of the applicant. 2, granting the requested variance to the limit on accessory structures would not adversely affect the rights of adjacent property owners because this lot is the only residential lot among the adjacent properties on the south side of North Street, and the applicant's property is entirely screened by mature shade trees. The I-3 and the C5 zone lots to the north and east contain multiple large metal buildings, and the proposed carport would be metal, so fire spread risk would be minimal, and the carport would not detract from visual appearance of the neighborhood, nor would it restrict the flow of air or block light on the adjoining properties. 3, strict application of the provisions of the zoning ordinance of which the variance is being requested will constitute an unnecessary hardship upon the property owner because although there are already 3 existing structures on this lot, none of them are capable of sheltering your vehicle. 4, approval of the variance to the limit of accessory structures would not adversely affect the public health, safety, morals, order, convenience, prosperity, or general welfare because approval of the variance as requested will not affect the general public. Any impacts from the proposed carport would be localized, and runoff from the carport addition would drain onto the owner's own land and would not go off onto neighboring properties. 5, granting a variance to the limit of accessory structures would not be opposed to the general spirit and intent of the zoning ordinance because the property or because the proposed carport would not encroach into any side yard or utility easement, and the applicant's property is relatively isolated as one of the only residential lots nearby. And the property also has an agricultural background, which makes it unique compared to a typical residential lot in a subdivision. And the proposed construction would not exceed the R1 limitation of 35% lot coverage. So on page 8 of your staff report, staff has provided a list of recommendations or recommended conditions of approval. Number 1, the proposed carport shall be compatible in design, material, and color with the existing house on the property. Number 2, the proposed detached carport shall maintain a 25-foot setback from North Street and at least 3 feet from the east property line and at least 3 feet from any existing structures. Number 3, construction must substantially correspond to the plans as submitted to the board and subject to a duly issued building permit. Number 4, the carport shall only be used for personal storage and personal use and not for any business purpose. And number 5, no additional accessory buildings shall be permitted on this lot without the approval of a variance by the Board of Zoning Appeals. And with that, staff is available for any questions, and the applicant's here to provide additional info if you need it.
All right, thank you. Are there questions for staff at this time? I have one question. Do you know of any similar situations that has come to the board of this nature?
There was one that I referred to, and I think Dean might have to help me here on what that address was, but it was similar, but it was a second detached garage on a large lot. Do you remember what that was, Dean?
Yeah, there was I think it was up on Antrim or a property that was north of Pacific, but it was a property that had a storage shed, it had an existing garage, and the applicant was applying to construct an additional garage and not remove the existing garage. And so it was a request to have more than 2 accessory buildings. But one, we were hard pressed to find any cases that had a similar circumstance as this for 1, looking at the number of accessory buildings, and 2, having a property come before the board that is nearly agricultural or more agricultural in nature and setting than it is in residential. And so it's the location and the more agricultural character of this property that makes it unique and hard for us to find any precedent, partially because of the size of the lot, partially because of the location, but you're not typically going to find a typical residential lot that has room for 4 accessory buildings, and this is well over an acre in size. It's remote and it's heavily wooded, so it's hard to find a comparable to this. And the other thing is, if you drive up Ohio to North Street and then proceed east on North Street, you're not going to find many residences or residential properties on the south side of North Street. So this is unique both as to the property and unique to the circumstance or the type of variance that's being requested. It's not one that you can commonly go to. The previous case, which was a corner lot with 2 front yard setbacks, that is common throughout the city, but a property like this, given its remote location and its semi-agricultural character, it's like one of the properties it's there, and then the city annexes it and brings it in as it is, and so it's unique from that standpoint. This is not a residential lot in a standard residential subdivision. This is kind of a standalone by itself situation, so not much precedent for this one.
When was this annexed? Do we have any idea?
1967.
1967.
Yeah, and we have, what our research seems to show is that there were outbuildings on the property dating back to the 50s when it wasn't in the city, and there was a home on the property. It looks like the home got torn down and replaced by the newer home, and the newer home was in the city limits. Dustin has the year in his report, and I don't have it in front of me, but I believe that the building permit for the home,
1972.
the property was in the city limits when the home was built, but most of the outbuildings predate the annexation. So they were there before. They predate the owner's ownership. They predate the annexation, and so the property had a home on it prior to annexation, and then a new home was built in the 70s to replace the existing home.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
Is there any type of residential zoning that would allow this kind of situation?
Well, we have some, and I don't know if you have the live GIS up, Dustin. When you're speaking to residential, no. If this property was zoned agricultural, this would be allowed. But what we're saying is it's agricultural in character, but it was given a residential designation. There's actually a few homes on the north side of North Street that are interspersed, but those homes are they're homes, but they're zoned industrial, and so they're not subject to. This is, if you asked us, should this be zoned R1? Is that a real good match for the character of the property? The answer is no. It's the character-wise, it has more of an agricultural character than a residential character, but the zoning is R1, and so given that it's R1, we're obliged to apply R1 standards to it. But we're pointing out that it is more agricultural than residential in character, and that nature predates that. I guess I would look at a different perspective is I grew up in the city and we had a chicken coop in our yard because our home was built in 1912 and it wasn't in the city when it was built. It was in a rural area and the city built up around it and we still had a chicken coop because based on the time of when it was built. And so if this property has been, the Thomas White Farm subdivision goes back to the early 1900s, and it's entirely possible that this property has been semi-rural since that time. So
The residences that are in the industrial area,
they are not subject to the residential limitations.
does industrial allow residents then?
It does not allow residents new, but they are grandfathered. They're grandfathered in, but we do not.
I drive the street all
So if the house on the north side of North Street burned down or was torn down, we wouldn't allow a new home to go back in its place because industrial doesn't allow it. But the existing residents can remain, and since it's zoned I-2, we wouldn't be applying the R1 accessory use limits. We wouldn't tell them that their garage can't be above a certain size. And so it's just a matter of what rules you can apply. So you can take note of the fact that this is zoned R1, and you can take note of the fact that this is not a typical R1 zone lot that you would find in a typical subdivision, because it's not in a subdivision.
So I guess that's where my struggle is it's unique in that it doesn't really fit in the R1 zoning, and they're asking for a variance from R1 zoning. Is there a better zoning that would fit in? And I don't think there is. Probably doesn't sound like there is. There is. You probably couldn't stick this situation in any zoning in the city that would allow this many accessory structures, I guess.
Only if it was, and I can't recall. I do believe that, to me, the most similar circumstance to this is East Cloud Street, east of the Dillon store and east of where the subdivisions end. And there are a number of dwellings on East Cloud, east of Ohio, that are zoned agricultural, and that you can find those homes or those residential sites that are zoned agricultural that would have a similar number of outbuildings as this, one, and two, outbuildings that are really big. And so, because agriculture doesn't have the same limitation. So I guess one way that staff looked at this and that you could look at it is that variances are designed to be a safety valve when there's a mismatch between the zoning and the zoning regulations and the actual conditions on the property. And so we can spend some time, but if you ask me as a planner what is the most appropriate zoning for this property, I would say A1, agricultural. And I could say the applicant had the bad luck that the city came along and made it R1 because Lakewood Park was R1, but Dustin has up East Cloud. And so you can look at East Cloud here, and there's a number of properties on East Cloud that are zoned A1. And so they're home sites, they're in the city limits, but they don't have the limitation on the number of outbuildings or things like that because of the fact that it's zoned agricultural. And there's vineyards back there, there's growing of different things. Those are home sites, but those home sites on East Cloud are more similar to what this home site is on East North Street and then you've got the outlier, which is this is a brand new home that was built here, and that's zoned residential, and that's a conventional residential lot. But it's surrounded by historical homes that were there before the city annexed the property, and so they retained their agricultural zoning. And if you so choose as board members, you can view the property owner of 1620 East North as having the misfortune of having R1 zoning on a lot that maybe is more agricultural in character. And so that's for you as board members to judge.
I was gonna
So
add
if we
one thing.
had property that was zoned A1, we wouldn't allow a residence to be built on that property.
No, you can have a residence on an A1 lot.
You can have it, but would it be grandfathered in, or can you go
You
ahead?
could come in and have it, if someone could build, if they had a 6-acre lot in the city that was zoned agricultural, we would issue a permit to build a home on it.
And we looked back through the back to when it was annexed and the maps that we have of the annexations, and I'm almost certain that it was brought in with R1 zoning from the beginning. And I know that we typically bring in as A1 by default. I don't know, Dean maybe can clarify if that was a two-step process the way it is now with the annex and then zoned to A1 or zoned to something different than A1, but it appeared from what I looked at that it was brought in as R1, so it is also one of those things where it wasn't ag and then changed to R1. It appears to have been zoned R1 from the beginning, which may or may not matter, but for your decision.
I would like to ask then, if we would approve this, do you see any problems in the future of this popping up? I mean, I drive by this frequently, so I know where it is, but I don't
Well, I
foresee
think
any.
one of the things that staff is, and we talked to the board about it, and you considered it in your last case, and you should consider, does this set a precedent where we can't distinguish this from a future case, or is this a bad decision from a precedent standpoint? I'm hard pressed to say that this is a precedent for anything because there's hardly any lots like this in Salina, Kansas. And so, I mean, if you took a whole map of the city of properties that are zoned R1, you probably have less than a handful that have this characteristic. And there was a plan back in the 1990s to build a restaurant and inn on the property to the east, and so that property was rezoned to build a restaurant, and it was zoned to C5, and then the restaurant didn't get built, but the C5 zoning allows for non-climatized storage, and I think that's the other thing that distinguishes this from other R1 zoned areas. It is very unusual to have a residential lot that's surrounded by all non-residential uses, that essentially has no neighbors. So there's no neighbors to impact. And so when staff was working on this, and that's why we put great effort into our staff reports and providing for you suggested findings, and those suggested findings, one of the things is that the need for a variance arises from conditions which are unique to this property and not shared by neighboring properties. If there ever was a case where the conditions are unique to the property and not shared by neighboring properties, this is one. And so what we try to do when we're giving you suggested findings is that we think these are findings that a decision can be based on that's not setting it up for a precedent that you have to follow for a future case, because this has sufficiently unique factors that make it different from any typical R1 residential lot.
I just have a general question, and not necessarily thinking that this would be a direction, but would another option be for them to request a change in zoning to A1? Just out of curiosity more than anything.
That if we could try to do that, but they may have to come back before you. I'm gonna double check our numbers here, but my recollection is that in the A1 district, there's a minimum lot size of 2 acres, and this has 1.6 acres. And so to be a residential lot, they might have to come before this board and ask for a lot size variance to be an agricultural lot, because it's pre-existing. And I guess I should have paid more attention. I've written 2 notes to myself that I wish we would have included in the report. One is what was the zoning when it was annexed, and what was the zoning when we issued the permit in 1973, because if you look at the chronology, it was annexed in 1967, a building permit was issued in 1972, and then in 1977, the city went in and comprehensively rezoned and remapped the city. And what I can't tell you is whether this zoning R1 is a product of that 1977. It would have been looked at in 1977, and I can't tell you if this was R1 because of that 1977 comprehensive rezoning, or whether, in fact, that's true.
It predates 1977. I know that much, at least, that it was R1 before that. Like I said, I don't know if when it was annexed it was zoned R1 immediately, but it was the earliest records we could find of the permits showed it being R1. And those predated the 77 comprehensive rezoning.
Okay. Other questions for staff at this point? Is the applicant present? Would you please step to the podium and give us your name and address, please?
I'm Betty Keir, live at 1620 East North Street.
Okay. Any other things that you would like to say about your place?
No, I just like to have a carport to put my pickup in, because all these windstorms we've been having, I'm just lucky that something hasn't hit it already. And the hailstorms. I got a new pickup, and well, it's 2017. It's new to me. And it's one of the nicer ones I've had, so I'd like to protect it.
Yeah. Are all of the buildings that are there now, the accessory buildings, are they in use?
The old barn has his lawnmower and canning jars and boxes of stuff. The old chicken house has these tools in it. And the other, I don't call it a building. It's a lean-to. It has no doors, has no windows, has no floor. It just has a piece of plastic about 8 feet wide on the roof. And that's where my bike is, and extra lumber, and my statues and stuff like that.
So it's functional.
It could be torn down. I mean, it doesn't really have a good use, but I can't see tearing it down. Then I'd have to figure out where I'm going to put my bike.
Okay, other questions for the applicant at this point? I guess we're good. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Do we have any comments by interested citizens? I didn't ask that one before.
We do not have anyone from the public online, so any public comment would come from the room.
Okay, very good.
In terms of notification, we notified Great Plains Manufacturing, who owns the non-climatized storage buildings that are directly to the east. And we notified ourselves as owners of Lakewood Park. And we notified the owners across the street to the north. And on the south, we have an agricultural field. So we did not receive any, when we mailed our notice out, we did not receive any feedback from neighboring owners.
Okay, very good. This time we'll bring back the application number V24-7 for further discussion and possible action. I do have one question then. So if we would like to provide some justification for if we decide to approve the variance, then we should probably attach one of the suggested findings to that so that would give some more clarity to future boards.
Yes, and that's why what we're trying to work for when we do our reports is so that you're not having to struggle to develop findings during the meeting. So we review that, we weigh what we see, we do that. So basically, our assumption is on your last item, there was a motion from Mr. Creer and a second to approve it, and we're treating that action was based on the suggested findings that we provided for you in the staff report. And so, of course, one way to do it is just to be careful in the motion that says, if you want to say, we move that this application be approved based on staff's suggested findings in the staff report, that says that you're basing your decision on that. And so what we have tried to do is cite the very specific, unique things about this, which on the spirit and intent, we pointed out that it's relatively isolated. It's only one of a few residential lots in the vicinity. It has an agricultural background, which makes it unique compared to a residential subdivision. And the lot coverage, even with the fourth building, is minimal. And so the point being, if we had a lot that was 75 by 120 feet and somebody said, I want to have 4 accessory buildings, that would probably be a very crowded residential lot with minimal green space and buildings very close to property lines. Well, this is a lot that's 1.6 acres, is bordered by trees, and has no residential neighbors. And so when we draft suggested findings, we try to identify those things and include it in the report so that if you are inclined to approve the variance, you can feel comfort of knowing that there are findings that will be attached to that for the record that form the basis of why you decided what you did. So when a variance is granted by this board and we do up a summary letter or action letter, we will inform the applicant that the variance application was approved, and we would say the board voted to approve it based on the following findings. And then we incorporate those in there, so anybody that's a planner or anybody working at the future just said, well, I wonder why the board approved this one and denied this one. Well, here's the findings that they based their decision on. And so that's why we incorporate those into our staff report. So
I guess there's also a record of our minutes too, of all our discussion, how we arrived at the decision, so.
right. Yes, that is there, and so the test is the board's decision reasonable under the facts, or was it just arbitrary and made up? And so we do our level best to make sure that no decisions are just arbitrary, so that no one could tell the reason for why the decision was made.
Okay. So would you suggest then the maker of the motion would select a finding, or say all of the findings, or?
It's all of the findings, because those 5 things, uniqueness and hardship being the hardest to meet, those are all factors that you can consider. And so when you see suggested findings, we have 5 suggested findings because those address the 5 factors. And so in the alternative one, says the board could approve the variance to the limit on the number of accessory structures as requested if the findings of fact can be made in this case. And so if you find those findings to be reasonable and supportable in this case, then if I was a board member wishing to make a motion to approve, I would say I would move that we approve the variance to the number of accessory structures based on staff's suggested findings.
Okay.
Or
All right.
you can make up your own findings or add to the findings or those things, but we try to provide that because it's very hard and it's an unfair burden on board members to be up there and try to formulate those at the dais.
Right.
I would like to make a motion.
Go ahead.
I would like to make a motion that the board approve the variance to limit the number of accessory built structures allowed on the residential as requested in the required findings of facts and the staff suggested findings, as well as the staff recommendations to the applicant that must be satisfied.
Very good. We have a motion to accept the application to include the suggested findings and the staff recommendations or the conditions of approval that are listed on the application. Is there a second?
I'll second.
You have a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? No. Motion carries. All right, we have
What?
any administrative items?
We have no administrative or housekeeping items. I'm going to look to the other planners to see if they're aware of any pendency of, well, tomorrow is the filing deadline for your November meeting, and I am aware of one potential variance case that we're working on that deals with a garage size question, and so I can't say for certainty that we would have no items for a November meeting because the filing deadline's tomorrow.
Okay, very good. I'm assuming we have no public forum.
We do not
Dustin.
have anyone from the public online, so any public comments would come from the room.
Okay. If hearing no other items, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Any second? We need a second.
Second.
All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.